The Dingle Peninsula in 1931. It was a place apart, you see, a finger of land pointing out into the wild Atlantic where the old ways clung on like ivy to a stone wall. Life here moved at a different pace, dictated not by clocks but by the turning of the tides and the changing of the seasons. The air was thick with the smell of turf smoke and salt spray. The silence was broken only by the bleating of sheep on the mountainsides and the cry of the gulls overhead. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. A world of small farms, tight-knit communities, and deep-rooted faith. In the townlands scattered across this rugged landscape like Gulain and Bale and Chota, worries were of a practical sort. Would the fishing be good? Would the hay be saved before the rain came sweeping in from the west? Would there be enough turf cut and dry to see them through the long, dark winter? The troubles of the wider world, of Dublin and beyond, felt a million miles away. Here the biggest dramas were local ones, a land dispute, a wedding, a christening. It was a simple life, a hard life in many ways, but a predictable one. People felt safe in their homes, their doors often left unlocked. A sense of peace, hard-won and deeply cherished, settled over the green hills and quiet valleys. The year was turning towards its end. The summer visitors, those few who braved the unpaved roads, were long gone. Autumn was painting the bracken on the hills in shades of rust and gold. In the evenings, families would gather around the hearth, the flickering light of the fire dancing on their faces as they shared stories and news of the day. The local Gardaí, the new police force of the young Irish Free State, had little to trouble them. A bit of poaching maybe, an argument after too many pints at the local pub. Nothing more. No one could have imagined the darkness that was about to descend upon their peaceful corner of the world. So, picture it. The mist rolling down from Mount Brandon, the soft glow of oil lamps in cottage windows, the rhythm of life, steady and unchanging for generations. It was into this very world, this seemingly idyllic setting, that a crime of unimaginable brutality would soon erupt. A crime that would not only shatter the peace of the peninsula but also send shockwaves across the entire country. It would expose the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most tranquil of surfaces. And for the people of County Kerry, life would never, ever be quite the same again. It was a classic story, really, a beautiful place with a terrible secret. Make sure to hit that subscribe button for more content like this. Her name was EllenOSullivan, and in the small townland of Gulain, she was a familiar, well-liked figure. At 46 she was unmarried, what they called a spinster back then. But she was far from alone. She lived with her brother Stephen in a small, whitewashed cottage, the kind you'd see on a postcard of old Ireland. Ellen was the heart of that home. She kept the house, tended the small garden, and looked after the accounts from their modest farm. She was known as a quiet woman, pious and hardworking, someone you could rely on, someone who always had a kind word. She was part of the very fabric of the community. Ellen wasn't just a homebody, though. She played a vital role in the wider community, a role that brought her into contact with many of her neighbors. She was the local agent for the Irish Agricultural Wholesale Society. This meant she handled the sale of eggs and butter for the surrounding farms, a crucial source of income for many families. Every week she would collect the produce, keep meticulous records in her ledger, and arrange for its transport. This made her a well-known and trusted figure. People from all over the area would call to her cottage on business, leaving their goods and trusting her to get them a fair price. She was, in many ways, the local bank and the post office all rolled into one. Her life was one of routine and responsibility. On market days she would travel into Dingletown, a bustling trip that was a highlight of her week. There she would settle her accounts and catch up on the news. She was known to be careful with money, both her own and that of her neighbors. She was saving, people said, perhaps for her old age, perhaps for something else. No one really knew. That was Ellen, private but present. A constant, steady presence in a world that was often anything but. She was a good daughter, a good sister, a good neighbor. And so, when she disappeared, it was as if a stone had been dropped into a perfectly still pond. The ripples spread quickly. It was unusual, you see. Ellen was reliable, punctual. She had her routines. Her absence was immediately noticed, immediately felt. Where could she be? Had she taken ill? Had she decided to visit a relative without telling anyone? The questions began as whispers, quiet concerns shared over a garden wall or a cup of tea. But as the hours turned into days, those whispers of concern would grow into a rising chorus of fear. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The search began in earnest. It was the 14th of November, 1931. Ellen had been missing for over a week. The initial hope that she had simply gone on an unannounced trip had long since faded, replaced by a gnawing dread. Her brother Stephen was beside himself with worry. Neighbors fanned out across the rugged terrain, their calls echoing across the empty hillsides. They checked with relatives in distant parishes. They scoured the laneways and fields she was known to walk, but there was nothing, not a trace. It was as if EllenOSullivan had simply vanished into the misty Kerry air. The community held its breath, praying for her safe return. The breakthrough, when it came, was grim. A local man named Tom Holohan was cutting turf in a lonely bog not far from Ellen's home. It was a desolate spot, windswept and remote. As his spade sliced into the damp peat, it struck something that wasn't turf, something soft. He cleared away the earth and peat, and the terrible truth was revealed. It was a human body, crudely buried in a shallow grave. The discovery sent a shock wave of horror through the search party and the wider community. Everyone feared the worst, and now, their worst fears were being realized in the most horrific way imaginable. The quiet bog had given up its awful secret. The body was soon identified. It was Ellen. But the state of her remains told a story of brutal violence that no one in this peaceful community could comprehend. She had been subjected to a savage attack. Her skull was fractured and her body was covered in bruises. The cause of death was strangulation, and perhaps most disturbingly, she had been shot twice in the chest after she was already dead. It was an act of unspeakable cruelty, an execution. The news spread like wildfire. This wasn't just a murder, it was a butchering. The sheer violence of it all was completely alien to their way of life. The shock quickly turned to fear. Who could do such a thing? And why? The killer was not some stranger passing through. The locals were certain of it. The way she was buried, the location of the grave, it all pointed to someone who knew the area, someone who knew Ellen. The awful realization dawned on the community. The monster who did this was one of them. He walked among them, shared the same roads, perhaps even sat beside them in church. The unlocked doors were suddenly bolted. Suspicion, a poison in the air, began to seep into the tight-knit community, turning neighbor against neighbor. The peace of the Dingle Peninsula was shattered, replaced by a chilling, pervasive fear. Into this climate of fear and suspicion stepped the Garda Síochána. This was the new police force of a new state, born out of the ashes of civil war. They were eager to prove themselves, to show that they could maintain law and order in this new Ireland. The murder of EllenOSullivan was a major test, one of the most high-profile cases they had yet faced. Detectives were dispatched from Dublin Castle, the heart of police operations. They arrived in Dingle with a sense of purpose, determined to bring the killer to justice swiftly. The local community looked to them for answers, for reassurance, for justice for Ellen. The investigation began as you might expect. The Gardaí cordoned off the bog where Ellen's body was found, a crime scene as we'd call it today. They meticulously searched the area for clues. They spoke to Ellen's brother Stephen, trying to piece together her last known movements. They examined her account books, looking for any financial irregularities that might point to a motive. Robbery seemed the most likely reason. Ellen was known to handle cash from the egg sales, and it was thought she might have had a considerable sum of money in the house on the day she was killed. The theory was simple. Someone knew she had the money and killed her for it. The detectives, led by the formidable Chief Superintendent Harry O'Mara from Dublin, began interviewing everyone. They cast a wide net, speaking to hundreds of people across the peninsula. They wanted to know who had visited Ellen's house, who had business with her, who might have held a grudge. They created timelines, checked alibis, and followed up on every scrap of local gossip. In an era before DNA testing or advanced forensic science, the investigation relied almost entirely on old-fashioned police work, interviews, witness statements, and the relentless pursuit of leads. It was a painstaking, methodical process, but the pressure was immense. The newspapers were full of the story, dubbing it the Goulayne outrage. The public was demanding a swift arrest. The Gardaí were under a microscope, their every move scrutinized. They needed a result, and they needed it fast. This pressure, this desperate need to solve the case and restore public confidence, would soon lead the investigation down a dark and controversial path. The desire for justice, it seemed, could sometimes lead to injustice. The methods the Gardaí were about to employ would leave a stain on the force that would last for decades. The investigation, which had started with such methodical promise, soon took a disturbing turn. The pressure from Dublin and the press was mounting. Chief Superintendent O'Mara and his team felt they were getting nowhere with polite questions. The wall of silence they encountered in the tight-lipped rural community was frustrating, so they changed tactics. The interviews became interrogations. The Gardaí began to rely on methods that were, to put it mildly, highly questionable. They were determined to break the silence of the peninsula, and they were prepared to use any means necessary to do it. The velvet glove was off. The iron fist was revealed. Reports began to filter out of the area about the Gardaí's conduct. People were being held for days on end, subjected to marathon questioning sessions without rest or legal counsel. These weren't hardened criminals, they were ordinary farmers, fishermen, and laborers, many of whom spoke little English. They were intimidated, exhausted, and confused. The interrogations were relentless, designed to break their will. The Gardaí were accused of using threats, intimidation, and even physical force to extract information. It was a tactic of terror, designed to create an atmosphere where people would be too scared to withhold anything. The local community, which had initially welcomed the Gardaí, now viewed them with fear and resentment. The police were no longer seen as protectors, but as an occupying force. There was a story, widely told at the time, of a group of men being taken to a remote location and threatened. Another man claimed he was forced to stand in a cold river for hours during his interrogation. Whether all the stories were true is hard to say, but the perception was real. The investigation became known not for its clever detective work, but for its brutality. The Gardaí were creating a climate of fear to solve a crime born of fear. This aggressive approach was a world away from the ideal of the unarmed guardians of the peace that the Garda Síochána was supposed to represent. It was more reminiscent of the old Royal Irish Constabulary, the police force of the British regime, which was deeply distrusted by the people. The Irish press, a newspaper critical of the government, seized on the stories, writing, "It is stated that a system of terrorism is being practiced by the police. The very methods being used to find Ellen's killer were alienating the community whose cooperation they so desperately needed. It was a classic case of the cure being worse than the disease." Out of this maelstrom of fear and forced confessions, the Gardaí finally focused on their man. His name was Bill Breen. He was a local man, a neighbor of the O'Sullivans. He fit the profile, at least in the eyes of the police. He was known to be in financial difficulty, which gave him a motive robbery. He had also done some work for Ellen and her brother, so he knew the cottage and their routines. Crucially, under intense and prolonged interrogation, several of Breen's relatives and neighbors signed statements that implicated him in the murder. They claimed he had confessed to them, or that they had seen him near the scene. Breen was arrested and charged with the murder of EllenOSullivan. The Gardaí were confident they had their man. They had signed statements, a clear motive, and a plausible suspect. The case seemed open and shut. For the detectives in Dublin Castle, it was a victory. They had solved the Ghoulain outrage and brought a killer to justice. The press reported the arrest, and for a short time it seemed as though the terrible chapter was closed. Justice, it appeared, was about to be served. Bill Breen, the quiet neighbor, was now painted as a cold-blooded murderer. His fate seemed sealed. But then, the case began to unravel. When it came to trial, the foundation of the prosecution's case, those signed statements, crumbled into dust. One by one, the witnesses who had implicated Bill Breen stood up in court and retracted their testimony. They told the judge and jury that their statements had been false. They claimed they had been coerced by the Gardaí, that they had been bullied, threatened, and exhausted into signing documents they knew weren't true. One key witness, Breen's sister-in-law, dramatically declared in court that her statement had been all lies. It was a stunning reversal. With its key witnesses recanting and tales of police brutality filling the courtroom, the prosecution's case against Bill Breen collapsed. The judge had no choice but to direct the jury to find him not guilty. Bill Breen walked out of the courthouse a free man, his name cleared in the eyes of the law, but the damage was done. The community was left stunned and divided. The Gardaí were left humiliated, their methods exposed and condemned. And the most important question of all remained unanswered. If Bill Breen didn't kill EllenOSullivan, then who did? The case was back to square one, but this time it was shrouded in scandal. The newspapers of the day were a battleground where the story of Ellen's murder was fought. The government-supporting papers, like the Irish Independent, initially praised the Gardaí for their swift action in arresting a suspect. They painted a picture of a police force efficiently getting to grips with a terrible crime, but as the trial collapsed, the tone changed. The opposition paper, the Irish Press, which was aligned with Eamon de Valera's Fianna Fáil party, had a field day. It published scathing editorials about the Gardaí's third-degree methods, drawing parallels with the old, hated British police forces. One headline screamed about the reign of terror in Kerry. The local people, whose lives had been turned upside down, had their own things to say, though often in hushed tones. An old farmer speaking to a journalist years later remembered the atmosphere. "You wouldn't know who to trust," he said. "The Gardaí would pull you in for questioning, and your own neighbor might be telling them lies to save his own skin." It was a terrible time. It put a poison between people that lasted for years. This sense of betrayal, both by the police and by each other, lingered long after the detectives from Dublin had packed their bags and gone home. The trust that had been the bedrock of the community was fractured, perhaps irreparably. The courtroom itself was the stage for the most dramatic declarations. Imagine the scene as Johanna Breen, Bill Breen's sister-in-law, stood in the witness box. The prosecution expected her to seal her brother-in-law's fate. Instead, she looked at the court and said her statement was false, that she had been told what to say by the Gardaí. "I was in their custody for 5 days, she reportedly testified. "I was terrified. I would have said Mass in Irish for them if they asked me to." That single powerful statement encapsulated the entire controversy. It wasn't about finding the truth anymore, it was about getting a confession, any confession. Even after Bill Breen's acquittal, the whispers didn't stop. Some people still believed he was guilty, that he had gotten away with murder on a technicality. Others were convinced of his innocence and pointed fingers at others in the community. The case created deep divisions, splitting families and setting neighbor against neighbor. The official story had collapsed, but in its place, 100 different unofficial theories sprang up, told and retold around turf fires for decades to come. The truth of what happened to EllenOSullivan was lost in a fog of accusation, coercion, and fear, and for the people of the Dingle Peninsula, there was no closure. The acquittal of Bill Breen was more than just the end of a murder trial. It was a public relations disaster for the Garda Síochána and the government of the day. The case exposed a dark underbelly to the new state's police force. The methods used in Kerry were seen as a betrayal of the ideals of the new Ireland. The government, led by W.T. Cosgrave's Cumann na nGaedheal party, was forced to act. The public outcry was too loud to ignore. They couldn't just let the scandal fade away. The integrity of the entire justice system was at stake, and something had to be done to restore faith in it. In response, the government established a formal inquiry known as the Guileáin Tribunal. Its purpose was to investigate the allegations of police brutality and coercion during the murder investigation. It was a landmark moment. For the first time, the Gardaí were being formally investigated for their own conduct. High-ranking officers, including Chief Superintendent O'Mara, were called to account for their actions. The tribunal heard evidence from dozens of local people who claimed they had been mistreated. The proceedings were followed avidly across the country, a real-life drama playing out in the halls of power. The findings of the tribunal were a damning indictment of the police investigation. It concluded that the Gardaí had indeed engaged in unwarranted and excessive zeal. It condemned the use of threats, prolonged interrogations, and the general atmosphere of intimidation that had been created. While it stopped short of finding evidence of direct physical violence in most cases, the message was clear. The Gardaí had crossed a line. Disciplinary action was taken against several of the officers involved. It was a major blow to the reputation of the force, but also a crucial step in its development. The long-term impact on Irish policing was profound. The Guileáin case became a cautionary tale, a lesson learned the hard way. It led to the introduction of stricter rules governing the questioning of suspects, known as the judge's rules, to prevent such abuses from happening again. It highlighted the importance of proper procedure and respect for the rights of citizens, even those suspected of terrible crimes. The scandal forced the Garda Síochána to mature, to move away from the heavy-handed tactics of its early years and towards a more professional, community-focused model of policing. In a tragic, indirect way, Ellen's death led to reforms that would protect countless others. Today, the Dingle Peninsula is once again known for its breathtaking beauty. Tourists flock there from all over the world, drawn by the dramatic cliffs, the ancient history, and the vibrant culture. The dark days of 1931 seem a lifetime away. The whitewashed cottages are now holiday homes and the quiet laneways are part of scenic driving routes. But if you know where to look, and if you listen carefully to the stories still told by the older generation, the ghost of EllenOSullivan still lingers. Her story has become a part of the local folklore, a dark thread woven into the rich tapestry of the area's history. The murder was never officially solved. After the collapse of the case against Bill Breen, the investigation went cold. No one else was ever charged with the crime. The identity of the person who so brutally ended Ellen's life remains a mystery, buried in the past. For the community, this lack of resolution left a deep and lasting scar. The suspicion and division caused by the investigation didn't just disappear overnight. For many years there was a quiet mistrust, a shadow that fell over relationships in the area. The murder and its aftermath changed the community forever, robbing it of its innocence. The case of EllenOSullivan serves as a powerful and chilling reminder. It's a reminder of the darkness that can exist even in the most beautiful of places. It's a reminder of how fear and pressure can lead to terrible injustices. And it's a reminder that the truth can sometimes be lost forever, becoming just another secret that the landscape keeps. The quiet bog where Ellen was found has long since been reclaimed by nature, the heather and gorse covering the place where her shallow grave once was. But the story remains, a story of a good woman, a brutal crime, and a search for justice that went horribly wrong. And so, the wind that blows across the slopes of Mount Brandon still seems to carry a whisper of her name, EllenOSullivan, a daughter of the Dingle Peninsula, whose tragic death exposed the fault lines in a young nation and left behind a mystery that endures to this day. Her killer took her life, but in a strange and tragic way, her story became immortal. A chilling piece of Irish history, a cautionary tale that echoes down through the decades. The case is closed, but for Ellen, there has never been any peace. And perhaps there never will be.